let's get to the reason we're all here tonight. Mike Naples Jr. I'm super excited to have him here. He's a co-founding partner of Floodgate. I like this tagline, Seed Investing OG. I can attest to that. I've been in the Valley since 96. I remember in the early days of seed funding, Mike was out there doing his thing, and there weren't a lot of other people doing that, right? So he's an early investor in Twitter, Twitch, Okta, Chegg, and a lot of other successful startups. He's on the Forbes Midas list 8 times. Before he became an investor, he was working at some companies that IPO'd, Tivoli and Motive. He wrote this awesome book. And I'm super excited because he's been on my list tab as a speaker ever since I saw him speak at Startup to Startup a long time ago, over 12 years ago it was at this point. And in the back of my mind, I'm like, gosh, it'd be great to get Mike to speak. And then when his book came out, and then I saw him talking with Amy Jo Kim, I'm like, oh, because Amy Jo's spoken here several times. I'm like, oh, cool, let's make the intro. So he's going to be talking, and we're going to have a fireside chat about how breakthrough products break the rules. So please join me in giving Mike a warm welcome. All right. Thank you so much for coming, man. Yeah.
Yeah, and I've had your book for a long time, so I'm a fan.
Thanks. You have this awesome book, Pattern Breakers. What made you decide to write that?
Well, I didn't think I was going to do it. So Peter Ziebelman at Stanford Business School convinced me to. The ideas came from an unsettling experience. So, as you pointed out, I was an investor in Twitch. And we did really well on that investment. So when it was bought by Amazon, we made 94 times our money on this.
Woo.
Now that's good, but here's the bad news is I had forgotten I was a shareholder in Twitch. So I had invested in a company called Justice,
right,
which was a terrible idea.
I remember that.
But it morphed into 2 companies, Social Cam and Twitch. And I was like, okay, clearly Social Cam is the real company. And so it got bought by Autodesk for $65 million. I thought that was the company. I mean, who's going to want to watch other people play video games? So I just forgot about Twitch. And so you can imagine what that's like. I have to call my investors and explain to them, hey, I'm sorry, this isn't how Floodgate likes to do things normally. I don't have Twitch in my financials. I know that I have audited financials. Do I need to restate my financials? And they were like, well, hold on a second here. What did you just say that, we're getting all this money that we didn't know about? I was like, yeah, well, that's the good news. And so they said, you don't have to do any audits. We're good.
Right.
Just send us the money.
Nice.
So I sent them the money and I got a bunch of champagne and stuff like that.
Nice.
Same week, I helped a company shut down. And they did everything you're supposed to do. You would have been impressed, right? They would have embodied a lot of the philosophies of low burn experimentation, high performance teams, customer centricity. They would have been a case study, except for the fact they failed. And I don't know if this resonates with some of you who've done startups or are doing them, but I saw this happen over and over again. Some of the companies I was involved with that had wild success, I could not explain it based on how well they executed, or Twitter wasn't doing a whole bunch of best practices that I could discern. The fail whale was happening all the time. They couldn't decide who the CEO should be. There was constant drama, and yet people wanted to tweet, and it just like everything they touched just seemed to work. And then Twitter and Chegg went public within a week of each other. And Chegg had been this crazy death-defying pivot to textbook rentals. And so I sat there and I was like, more than 80% of my exit profits have come from these pivots. And, what business am I even in? What am I doing? And should I just retire before I get exposed? And, because what luck giveth, luck will taketh away pretty fast. And so that was the original journey was, okay, what's going on here? Maybe it's really random, but maybe it's not totally an accident either. But I can't explain what's happening based on normal frameworks of startups. And so I worked on this thing for about 3 years and tried to find a time capsule on all these great startups. And about that time, I was a guest lecturer in Pete's class, Pete Ziebelman. I know somebody here is good friends with Rick Barry at Demand Force. And so Peter and I had been on that board together. And so he said, hey, why don't you come talk to my class? And I did a couple of lectures, and Peter was like, hey, look, I'm starting to change how I teach this class because of some of what you're talking about. We should do a book. And I was like, no, I don't want to do a book. I don't have time for this. I'm not an author. You can't make any money doing books. Like, it's a waste of time. Forget about it. But he slowly but surely convinced me to do it. So that was the genesis of the book. If you told me 5 years ago that I would do a book, I would have never believed that was going to happen.
Right. Yeah. No, and I listened to it, and you did a great job narrating it. It's well written. It's awesome. The way I would summarize it from a PM lens is kind of like it's a guidebook on disruptive innovation, how to create disruptive products, and a very nice framework that's there. And then the foundation is kind of inflection theory, right? Yep. So, and we'll go through it. Can you just explain what inflections are so people can understand it?
Yeah. So the thing that I think really hit me over time was that a startup is a different type of capitalist organization, right? So like most people, when they think of capitalism, they think of companies, and they think of, okay, I want to create a moat and sustainably compounding advantages. But a startup doesn't have anything to compound. A startup doesn't have anything at all. They don't have customers. All they have is the founders and their idea. And so I realized that startup capitalism isn't about compounding something. They create value in a different way. They create value by changing the subject. And the startup has the power to change the subject if it can fight in an unfair way, right? So business is never a fair fight. The only question is who gets to fight unfair. And the default is that the incumbents will fight unfair because they have the advantage of the incumbency. So if we're a startup, we have to have some way to wage asymmetric warfare on the present. And the way we do that is with inflection. So an inflection, an example could be Lyft. The iPhone 4S had a GPS chip in it. So you could have had the idea for ride sharing before the iPhone 4S. It wouldn't have mattered. You couldn't have implemented a system that embodied that idea. But now all of a sudden, the iPhone 4S represented a turning point in human empowerment potential. And so what an inflection does is it's the introduction of something new that offers the opportunity to radically alter human capacities and behaviors. And what the founder does, the inflections happen without the founder, right? What the founder does is they create an insight that is a breakthrough understanding the future that harnesses that inflection to create something that shows up seemingly out of nowhere. And so better doesn't matter with startups. You have to be different because, like, when you think about it, if you're better, then the customer will always have a good enough alternative to your better. So I like to say that a startup needs to force a choice and not a comparison. Like, does anybody have a Cybertruck? So a Cybertruck's not a startup, but it embodies kind of what I'm talking about. Who wants a Cybertruck? Not that many people. Who does not want a Cybertruck?
Okay. Polarizing. Yeah.
So when I first saw the Cybertruck, I thought Elon was joking, right? Like, I thought, is he going to ship this? Like, is that real?
Like the flamethrower. Yeah.
Yeah, I was like, is he kidding? But like, so you may like the Cybertruck's kind of growing on me. You may dislike it. You may think it's ridiculous, right? But one thing nobody ever asked is, how does it compare to a Ford F-150, right? Like, Elon says, live in my future or don't. But he forces a choice. And so that's when startups win. Nobody after they tried Twitter said, how's that compared to blogs? Nobody after they got in a ride share for the first time said, how's that different from a taxi? It was self-evident how different it was. If you have to answer that question, you already failed. Well, you didn't fail, but you did not succeed at the task of forcing a choice. And so that's what a startup capitalist does is they say, you know what? I know that there's rules right now, but I refuse the premise of the rules. I simply deny the premise, and I'm going to show up with something radically different, and I'm going to make you react to what I'm doing. And that's how the startup gets the upper hand. And so that's what I learned is that like, just like you could explain how big companies succeed, Michael Porter 5 Forces, or, all these different things, there was a mechanism to explain how startups could succeed. And it was, the inflection gives the founder, it's sort of like the Rock and David's slingshot against Goliath. And then what the founder does is they convert that inflection into an insight about the future that's not consensus and right. And then they deliver a product that can't be compared to anything that's come before. and they find desperate people for that empowerment. And so I define product market fit as what can we uniquely offer that people are desperate for. And if you have a powerful idea that's unique, there will always be someone desperate for that empowerment if it's empowering enough. And so that's product market fit, is the art and science. And that's what your book talks about, right? Is like, how do you navigate an insight to the desperate damn fast, right?
Yeah, and it's a great distinction between kind of incremental or organic innovation, where you're trying to be 10, 20% better, and what I would say you describe as disruptive innovation, where you're kind of changing the rules of the game. And that's what allows asymmetric warfare, right? That's what allows a 10-person startup to beat a 1,000-person company. It's like the inflection is what enables that to potentially happen if they take advantage of it in the right way, right?
Yeah, and so Don Valentine said it in a way that really struck me back in the day. He said, I want to invest in a startup that has such a powerful idea that they can execute terribly and still win.
Right. Because
they will execute terribly. And he's like, how could they not? They don't have any money. They don't have any people. Right. Like if it depended on who had the better execution capacity, the incumbent companies would always win. Always. Right. So the startup has to win in spite of its lack of execution. And so, like, you want to pursue an idea that even if you did a C- job of executing, it's so powerful it doesn't matter, that the customers literally pull the product out of your hands and take you to the promised land. And so that's what I started to realize, is that just some ideas embody a set of powers that just make them superior opportunities. And that's what I needed to be focused on. I needed to be focused on the founders that had those kind of ideas. And when I worked with the founders, I needed to encourage them to pursue those kind of ideas, because, like, I don't worry about failure in the traditional sense. I think the only way a founder really fails is to lose their time, because you never get your time back. And so, like, I met so many founders who were 5 years into a startup, and now they're pursuing it out of obligation and not passion. You know, now they've got employees, they've got investors, they made commitments. They no longer believe in the upside that they once did, but they're stuck, they're trapped. And that's what you want to avoid is the slog.
Yeah.
I'd rather say we're pursuing an insane risk, and we'll know in a year or not whether it's going to go our way. If it doesn't go our way, we get our time back.
Yeah.
Because as an entrepreneur, you only have to be right once if you go after big enough ideas. And so, like, that's what I'm in it for. Yeah.
It makes me think of the debate that investors like to have of, like, would you rather invest in a great market, a great team, a great idea? What's your...
Well, yeah, yes. Yeah. Well, so to me, there's a little bit of to me, a great team and a great market are not independent variables, because a great team will identify great.
That's what made me think of when you were saying that.
Yeah, and so like if there's a great team and they're pursuing a bad market, my first instinct is to ask, are they as good as I thought they were? Right? Because having said that, there is an aspect of it. I call it founder future fit. So like Justin Kahn, when he started Justin TV. So, like, literally, I'm in a coffee shop. I'm being pitched by a company called Weebly. This was a very profitable 2 hours. So we invested. I'm like, I like these Weebly guys. I'm going to invest in this company. And this guy walks into this coffee shop, and he's got a baseball cap, and he's got a camera. He's got wires going into the backpack and a hoodie. And I'm like, that guy's strange. And didn't really think anything of it. And he comes walking into the coffee shop, and Dave Versenko, Weebly, says, hey, did you get your email from me earlier today? And I said, what are you talking about? He goes, we're friends with this guy, Justin Kahn. Would you take his pitch? And so, like, as they're saying that, he's walking up to the table, he sits down, and he turns his laptop towards me, and I'm on the screen of his laptop, live casted. And he goes, my name's Justin Kahn. I'm going to do a live reality TV show of my life on the internet. And I look at him, and I'm like, that is one of the dumbest ideas I ever heard. Like, it's like, what you're describing isn't even reality TV. That's not how reality TV works. Like, you're like a fishbowl camera on your life. It doesn't make sense. And he's like, you're supposed to be a seed investor. Why are you crapping on my idea? I'm like, because it's terrible. But I'm like, how do you even make this work? What's in your backpack?
Yeah.
And like, he goes, well, EVDO cellular combined with internet software. We got this guy on our team named Kyle Vogt. He's a genius. And he's made this stuff work. Turns out Kyle started Cruise Automation, his next company, right? So I'm like really interested in what was in the backpack. And then I found out that evening that they'd sold their prior company on eBay for $250,000. And like, who sells their company on eBay?
Yeah.
And so I was like, this is my kind of guy. Like, even if he fails, it'll just be fun to get into business with this guy.
Yeah.
And so they end up pivoting to Twitch.
Yeah.
But here's the thing that I realize now, and this gets back to authenticity and good founders. Justin Kan wanted to be internet famous before there was a word for influencer. Like, it was the perfect opportunity for him to pursue. And he had an intrinsic motivation for that opportunity that caused him to have very good instincts about what to build and caused him to be very credible with early believers. Justin's second company, everybody wanted to fund. Atrium, legal tech automation. Justin doesn't care about lawyers or legal tech. So it failed. It didn't matter how much money he raised. It didn't matter how good of a founder it was. It didn't matter how experienced he was. And so that's, to your question about, there are some times where a founder will pursue something not for the right reasons, even though they're great.
Yeah.
Justin wanted to be a high status founder like Brian Chesky or Patrick Collison. That's why he started Atrium.
Right.
That's not a good reason to start one.
Yeah.
So that I like to say, it's just like Darwin talks about survival of the fittest. It's not survival of the best, it's the best fit. Founding teams are like that, right? Like, there's usually in any given opportunity segment, there's a team that is ideally matched to that opportunity because of their motivation and skill. And like, that's who you want to back.
Right.
And that team may not translate well to another opportunity.
Right.
Or at least as well.
Right.
Yeah.
Cool. Right. Well, one thing after reading your whole book, I was like, okay, I get the inflections. Then I was like, one point of view is these inflections happen and the founders try to pounce on them. Then I found myself wondering, can you initiate one? Can you be the initiator? You know what I mean? Instead of it being like reactive
I think you can. And it was, that was a tricky part. One of the parts that's hard about writing a book is it's like writing code and it only executes one way.
Yeah.
You're not in the margin saying, well, you could look at it this way too. And so what I concluded was, like, so for example, what you raised, like the iPhone itself, you could say it embodied inflections, but clearly it was an inflection, right? Like the presence of the iPhone created a whole ecosystem of opportunities. So that would be an example of what you're describing. But what I realized is that this book needed to be for founders.
Right.
And so I needed to answer the question from what the founder would care about. And what the founder would care about, in my opinion, is there a change event that I can harness that creates empowerment?
Got it.
And so regardless of how it comes about, right? And so that's kind of how I decided.
Kind of back to David and Goliath. By definition, David doesn't have the power, ability to create the inflection themselves.
And I was like, even if they did, congratulations.
Right. Yeah. Gotcha. Okay. That's great. That's great. Cool. Okay.
But it's like, to me, the inflection is also interesting because it reminds me of waves. And it's like, if you're a surfer, you got to catch the right wave ultimately. But if you're a crappy surfer, you'll just crash on the wave.
Right.
And so you got to have the presence of both. But the wave is a necessary precondition. All the power of the ocean is underneath you, in the same way that the inflections create the empowerment opportunities for the startup, I think.
And to stick with that metaphor, the timing matters. You can catch the wave too early or too late.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
That's exactly right.
Cool. Okay. So that's inflections. And then you mentioned insights a little bit. Can you go a little bit more into like what insights and good practices and insight formation? So
one of the things that is counterintuitive, but it's another one of those things, it's obvious when you think about it, is if everybody likes your startup idea, it's not a good startup idea. and why is that? Well, human beings are conditioned to like things. And so if everybody likes your idea, it's too similar to what they know, which means it's too much of an incremental change. And so ironically, you have to depart from the consensus to be a great startup. You have to. And it's actually not true just as startups, it's true in life. Like if you want to be, let's say that you want to be a good stock picker, you can buy the index and you might do well, you might not do so well, but you're going to do as well as everybody else who bought the index. You're not going to outperform. You'll just perform according to how the market performs. If you want to outperform the market, you have to risk underperforming the market, right? So like if I buy stock in Intuit right now, there's the crowds, the wisdom of the crowds, half of the wisdom of the crowds thinks I'm wrong to buy Intuit right now. it's independent of whether Intuit's a good company or a good stock. That's already priced in. So in order for me to make money buying Intuit stock, I have to risk losing money buying Intuit stock, which means I'll underperform the index. So you can't outperform the index without taking the risk of underperforming the index when you buy a stock. That's what you're doing. That's true of all things. And so you have to depart from the consensus. And so that's one of the hard parts about the entrepreneurship is that when you're non-consensus and right, you don't know if you're right at first, right? You only know that you're non-consensus. If you knew that you were right, then the future's too obvious that you're pursuing. It's got to be somewhat unknown, right? It has to be, or else the upside isn't enough. The more obvious the future is, the more incremental the future is. And so you have to go after something that you're non-consensus, but you can't categorically say you're right about yet. And that was one of the other vexing questions that took a long time to figure out.
And I know you mentioned Andy Radcliffe for that one, and I wanted to throw it up here, just and what I like is the version where it's like a little dollar sign. If your consensus is right, you'll make a little bit. You might make a little bit of money, but to really create a lot of value, you need to be consensus.
Yeah, and so there's another reason you want to be non-consensus and right, and that is that if you're right and within the consensus, it's just like buying the index. Your outperformance gets arbitraged away because you encounter mindless competition. You play the comparison game. You get caught in the comparison trap. So, but the other thing is kind of more visceral. A startup is kind of like a baby wildebeest born on the African Serengeti plain. And if you've ever seen a baby wildebeest, it plops out of its mom and it's wet and it's in this sack and it gets out and it's struggling to even get up on its feet. And if it's not on its feet running in 5 minutes, the mom's like, sorry, dude, sucks to be you. I'm out of here, right? And then they're sitting there by themselves and Nubian vultures start circling and jackals and hyenas and all that stuff. So a startup is in that vulnerable baby wildebeest state. And so you almost don't want the world to care about what you're doing, right? Because you want to have a chance to screw up a lot. And you want to screw up in a way that there's not a lot of public scrutiny. You want to be doing stuff that big incumbents don't care about, right? You need to have some time to grow up and be a robust animal. And, so that the other value of being non-consensus and right is you have the opportunity to execute poorly for a while you sort of find your footing. Yeah. And if there's no margin of error for execution, it's hard for a startup to win.
Yeah. It makes me think of the Earth video where the iguanas are running, baby iguanas running from the snakes. It's kind of the same thing. Yeah. But speaking of eggs, I have to go back now. So the first time I heard you talk, you were using thunder lizards. So that was the description. Can you just explain to everybody what a thunder lizard is?
Yeah. So thunder lizard, the metaphor comes from Godzilla. So for those of you who are Godzilla zealots, for those of you who aren't, Godzilla was hatched from radioactivated atomic eggs and swam across the ocean and emerged with an attitude, and then began destroying cities, breathing fire on things, and eating trains like they were sausage links, and swiping holes in buildings. And so I always thought that I call it a thunder lizard was a good metaphor for a disruptive startup, because a disruptive startup's like a capitalist mutation that's radioactivated. And, to me, the inflection is the thing that makes the egg radioactive,
exactly.
Right? And so my job as a startup investor, metaphorically, is to have a better Geiger counter to figure out, that egg's radioactive. I don't necessarily have to care if the thing that comes out of it looks like a T-Rex creature or an ichthyosaurus Mothra or pterodactyl looking thing. I just want it to be big and scary and a mutation that changes the rules and plays offense. And so, but my job is to sort of, it's like in physics, you have potential energy and mechanical energy. The later stage that you invest, the more you're caring about mechanical energy. You can look at the data about the company's performance and cohorts and all that. I invest purely in potential energy, right? I don't know exactly how the dots are going to forward connect. I just have to believe that the idea embodies a set of powers that give it the opportunity to be massive if it works. But I don't know exactly how it might work. That's up to the founder.
Yeah, cool. And you mentioned briefly founder future fit, and you say in the book that in order to find these insights and inflections, you need to live in the future. Can you explain to people about that?
So that was for me, the cheat code on how do you go after something that's not consensus and right if you don't know that you're right. You do it by living in the future. And so like what happened, what I sort of realized is that, we talk about getting out of the building when we talk to customers, but before you get out of the building, you want to get out of the present. And because the future is already here, it's just not evenly distributed. William Gibson was right. So like Mark Andreessen, when he came up with the Mosaic browser, he was at the University of Illinois in a supercomputer lab. He wasn't caring about the market for browsers. In fact, everybody who cared about the market was thinking about the digital superhighway and who's going to build it, Time Warner, AT&T, the government. Nobody knew that some kid making minimum wage at a supercomputer lab was going to have the right model for how it's going to work. But Mark was living in the future. And so, there's like a bell curve of people. Most of us are living in the present. Some people are living in the past, but some people are living in the future. And these inflections come over like an event horizon, right? And the people who are in the future, first of all, they see it first. But what's more important is they're hanging out with like-minded people. So they're all talking about the same new thing. And it's by living in the future that the entrepreneur experiences firsthand the way that the inflection can change how people think, feel, and act. They see immediately in front of them the empowering conditions of the technology that can break the pattern. And so like when I would talk to these founders, how'd you come up with your idea? Over and over again, they would look at me like they felt guilty that they needed to explain it more than they could. What I realized is they were living in the future. They had a privileged vantage point about the future. Because they had that privileged vantage point, it was obvious to them. Like, if you and I live in a desert, sand dune, and Sam over here lives in an oasis, it's pretty obvious to Sam what's good about the oasis, right? It's like if you ask them, hey, how did you know oases are different from sand dunes? He'd look at me like, what are you talking about? There's palm trees, there's water. It's awesome in the oasis, right? Yeah. And so that's what happened is what you realize is that the founders who had great startup ideas, they didn't come up with them by trying to think of a startup. They came up with their great ideas by living in the future, seeing the empowering conditions of that future, and then noticing what was missing in the future and building what was missing in the future. So like I like to say the best way to come up with startup insights that are worth pursuing is live in the future and build what's missing there. And if you build what's missing in the future, your intuition about what to build is far more likely to be right? Like Mark Andreessen was building something to make the internet immediately more useful for him. And so he knew what he wanted to build because he knew he was building the thing he wanted. Just like Steve Wozniak when he built the first Apple computer. So those people just had a huge advantage because it was almost like they got to time travel to a valid future before the rest of us. And so that's one of my favorite questions when I diligence a startup is this from the future?
Right.
And, some of you may laugh at this, but like a lot of times I'll get pitched and I'll say, okay, is this from the future? And the founder will say, I'll give you an example. I'm doing a mental health app, mental health's a crisis. I'm like, I agree. It's a crisis. We need to fix it. So I'm going to do a mental health app. And I'm like, great. I agree. That's a good idea. Is this from the future? Well, in the future, I think we need to solve mental health. I'm like, that's not what I'm asking. I'm not asking about your ideas about the future. I'm not interested in your opinions about the future. I'm interested in knowing whether you're living in it in a differentiated way from how I'm living in it than anybody else is. And people often struggle with that question.
Yeah, sure.
And the reason they struggle with that question is they tried to think of a startup. And when they try to think of a startup, they solve present pain for present customers and present markets. That's the great lie. The great lie is, hey, market is what really matters in a startup. That's not a lie per se, but then the next set of steps is the lie. The lie is, so therefore go find big markets and do an assessment and look for unmet needs in those big markets, solve a problem for the unmet needs. by building the unbuilt thing. But if you do that you're buying into the rules as they've been defined in that market. What you want to do is have a product that creates the market. You want to be the king of the future market that the inflection enables. So the inflections allow you to have a product that shows up differently in the world, defining an entire new market. And now you get to define the rules of that market. You become the category king of that market. That's the kind of stuff we look for.
But if you go too far that way, I've also heard VCs hate it when they ask the question, who are your competitors? And they're like, I don't have any competitors. Right? Yeah. I mean, because that's kind of scary because it means there's not a market there, right? So I don't know. How do you contrast those two things?
Yeah, it's interesting. I had this same issue when I started Floodgate because at the time there weren't really any seed funds. There was us and First Round Capital, right, other guys. And so I'm talking to LPs and I can barely spell LP, right? I didn't know any LPs. I didn't know anything about it. I didn't know any of the technical jargon of venture. And so I had this one slide. I said, VCs, 5 million and above, angels, 250K and less, lean startups, new opportunity, 500,000 is the new 5 million, seed funds. Okay. And so I just said, I believe there's going to be a new category of seed funds. And it's going to be a thing because there are going to be a lot of entrepreneurs who want to raise $1 million in Silicon Valley. And they would say, and then they would say, well, what about your competitors? And I'd said, okay, let's think about that. If you're Peter Fenton at Benchmark, are you going to leave Benchmark to compete against Floodgate? I don't think so. Right. If you're John Doerr, Klein Perkins, are you going to leave Klein Perkins? I don't think so. The only people who are going to leave firms to compete with me are going to be the underperformers. And if an underperformer wants to compete against me on my turf, I'll take that. I'll take that bet. You decide if you want to invest in it or not. But I think that what I try to encourage people to do is very quickly have one slide that says, this is the fundamental thing I believe is true about what's about to happen. And if you're not prepared to potentially agree with what I'm about to say, none of the rest of what I'm talking about is going to make any sense to you. I'm not I can just give you your time back because if we can't agree on this basic premise, nothing else will make sense. So now if you get people to agree on the premise of your insight, now when they say, well, what about competitor X? You can say, they're a great company, but recall, they're in this category over here. They're not here, they're there. And if you believe the initial premise that we talked about, I wish them well, but it has nothing to do with us, right? They're not present, right? They're
in the future.
So you want to talk about the competitive landscape and ecosystem, and you want to be realistic and tough-minded about it. But what you don't want is the chart that says 10 competitors and I have an X in every column and the other guys have fewer checks than I have. Right.
The feature checklist wars. I hate the feature checklist, which is an awesome segue, perfect segue to the next thing, which is I was not surprised and excited to see talking a lot about problems versus solutions in your book and how people tend to default to solutions. And so I don't know if you want to, it'd be great to hear your advice on that front.
Yeah. And the guy who said it well, there's an essay that Paul Graham wrote once, where he talked about his first startup failed because he was trying to create art galleries online. And the problem is that he had a mental model for what people would want from art galleries that just wasn't true about what other people wanted. It was just his opinion about what was true. And so most startup ideas that fail, there's all kinds of ways to fail, but that's a good way to fail, right? Because if you think about it, the startup falls in love with a solution. They have an opinion about something that the world should have that is their opinion inside their head, but it's not validated by any desperate people in the real world. Nobody's desperate for that. Those ideas fail. But that's an example of falling in love with a solution. You want to fall in love with a problem, because if you fall in love with a problem, you identify the desperate. And, they're not going to buy from the startup unless they're desperate. Why would they? Why, if I have any credible alternative but to buy from a company 80% likely to go out of business, why would I buy from the startup? I wouldn't. And so the person who buys from the startup has to say, I want this empowerment so bad, and you're the only person that can give it to me, that I'm willing to put up with everything that it entails, comes with the territory of working with a startup. And that is a high bar, right? And that requires somebody to be desperate, not just you to have an opinion about what's cool.
Which brings up for me, which I love to see also, you had amazing references. You referenced Geoffrey Moore crossing the chasm. He's spoken here 3 times.
Yeah,
and so
awesome.
we're talking about that early adopter, the visionary segment that feels the pain so bad that they're desperate for that new solution, right?
Yeah. And it's the other thing about it is there's their desperation, but also what I liked about Geoffrey Moore's book that I think doesn't get as much credit as it deserves is what Moore understood is it's not just that they're different types of buyers, they have different risk profiles, right? So like in my ancient days at Silicon Graphics, we worked with this company, Industrial Light and Magic, and we were trying to see if we could do dinosaurs in Jurassic Park. And at the time, there wasn't a lot of movies doing CGI. Now we take it for granted. And they're like, can we make dinosaurs look real? And we're like, I don't know. That's really freaking hard, harder than anything that's ever been tried. But they're like, well, if anybody can, you guys can help us. Nobody else even has a prayer of helping us do it. But they didn't say, send us your best hardware and we'll see you in 6 months when the movie's ready. It's like we had 4 deployed engineers at Industrial Light and Magic, and we were writing custom software for the pipelines to make those dinosaurs render and re-render overnight and multiple layers of skin and integrating with their nonlinear editor. And it's like, it was us working with them. You co-create the future with your lighthouse customers. It's not accurate to say just the startup creates the future. You co-create it with those early believers. And they didn't treat us like we were a vendor. They treated us like we were co-creating the future. And so, but what happened was, okay, Jurassic Park comes out. And it's hard for people to remember how groundbreaking those effects were, right? So right after Jurassic Park comes out, every single studio in Hollywood's like, I want to know exactly what Industrial Light and Magic used to make that movie. Don't confuse me with any facts. Just give me the list. I'm buying that. Every single studio in Hollywood was buying just $10 million worth of our gear for every movie. Yeah. Whatever software ILM has, I want it to. Just tell me the answer. Let's go. So ILM took us to the promised land, right? They were, but ILM wasn't like the other studios at the time. If we'd done that with other studios, it wouldn't have worked. Yeah. Because they weren't future led enough. ILM bought from SGI, not for practical reasons, but for aesthetic reasons. So they, guys I remember John Knoll and some of these people, they're like, we're going to make these dinosaurs look awesome, right? And that was what they were in it for. They weren't in it for what's the ROI of making dinosaurs, right? And so, but those customers, right, they lead you to the promised land because they're just not equal to the rest of the customers. That's why I call them lighthouse customers, like a beacon that shines through the fog of uncertainty, right? And they you show them the future so they tell you what you should really build. That's kind of what it's kind of like. Yeah.
Cool.
Anyway, talk too much.
No, you're right. Yeah. And so we're talking about ideas, and so you need to have an inflection, you need to have an insight, and then you have your initial idea, and the initial idea doesn't always work perfectly. So some teams can it's a whole should I persevere or pivot debate, and you have some comments in there about local maximum, things like that. Can you explain and share your thoughts on that?
Yeah.
How a team should think about when to stick to it versus when to pivot?
So here's the thing I think I learned about, and this is why I think that we've had success with pivots. So I like to say that when you invest in a seed round, you're really investing in 2 things. The awesomeness of the founding team and all the things that entails. Are they an authentic match to the opportunity? Are they talented? Do they have the stuff to change the world and move people to a different future? All that stuff. But the other thing you're betting on is the insight. And what I realized is that your first product is really a reference implementation of your insight. And so if your insight is correct, even if your product implementation isn't right yet, you have a first mover advantage into the future. Because another way to think about an insight is it is a very risky, underpriced future that most people aren't pursuing because it's so risky and because it's unknown. you're out there in the future, and even if you see that it's not working, your implementation is off, you're getting feedback from the future that other people aren't getting. You're learning things that you're discovering undiscovered things. And a great founder will navigate their implementation to the desperate. And that's how product market fit happens in a pivot. Like, pivot is a great term. It's a perfect metaphor, because in basketball, I suck at basketball, but like Sam was on Stanford's basketball team, so he can back me up here.
Right.
So like, when you pivot in basketball, you hold your pivot foot planted. That's the insight. You don't want to change the insight. You want to hold the insight firm, because that's all you have, that in the team. When you pivot, you're moving your body in basketball. You move your body in a startup by varying either the audience of your product or the implementation of your product. But the art and science of product market fit is iterating the implementation and the audience until you navigate it to the desperate. And, you know, you want to get to a place where someday you can answer, what do we uniquely offer that people are desperate for? And when you think about it, if you have really powerful inflections, you should have something really powerful, because you can offer something that has never been offered before. If you have an insight, then only you can offer it. So it's axiomatic that somebody should be desperate for it. And so that's kind of where you want to get to. But you want to hold your pivot foot firm, because if you leave your pivot foot, you no longer have any grounding at all, right? You have nothing left. You have no raison d'etre.
Right. Well, back in the day when it was the early days of the seed investing, I remember I'd go to these meetups, these things, and these happy hours, and I'd meet the same entrepreneur. And if I saw them like 3 months in a row, I was like, oh yeah, I pivot. I'm like, if you pivot 4 times, you're going in a circle, buddy. You've left.
Yeah, that's a mulligan.
Mulligan. There you go. Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah, like you know, this is one of the reasons, by the way, that most pivots work quickly if they're going to work. Because like a pivot leverages an unfair learning advantage from the failure that just happened. And so in theory, if you had an unfair learning advantage, you should have an advantage in getting the right product premise. If you don't, then you have to start more and more doubting the original premise. But the other thing is, it's just hard to keep the team. It's hard to keep the investors on board. It's just like the momentum, the tide starts to go against you in a really strong way. But like, it's like, you know, it is interesting to think of an insight as a very high risk, but even higher expected value underpriced future. And you're pursuing that future while others aren't. And in pursuing that future, you're trying to be a learn-it-all and learn as fast as you can and navigate your insight to the desperate. And then all of a sudden you got a shot at being pretty good.
Yeah. And something you said in your book related to that totally resonated with me is like, if you're in the right market and you have the right insight, the market will pull it out of you. They'll pull the right idea. They'll force your pivot. And I used to work in submarines, so it always makes me think of like a torpedo. When you shoot a torpedo at something, you don't have to get the angle exactly right. You just shoot it in that general thing, and then it starts to home in. You know, I feel like if you're on the right insight, talking to the right people, they'll guide you to higher and higher product market fit.
That's right. And you know, like the Industrial Light and Magic example is a good one to illustrate that, right? Like, there was no arguing about your vision versus mine when we're trying to make dinosaurs work in Jurassic Park. We're like, okay, we don't know how to do it now. What are the things that are preventing us from doing it? Let's do those things. But like, they were pulling product out of us, right? There was a natural gravitational force to pull product out of us. And everything that we built was going to be valuable for them and for other people, right? There wasn't any debate about, should we build this or not? And that's kind of what it feels like when something's being pulled. You know, when you got product market fit and people are pulling product out of you, what I found is it's a different set of drama than normal startup drama. All the drama is like, it's like Scotty on the Enterprise.
Yes.
Ship. Oh, she's not going to hold up here. She's not going to make it. There's too much demand.
Right.
You know?
Yeah.
And so it's like, you know, I was, in fact, Baiju Bhatt from Robinhood, I was hanging out with him the other day, and we were talking about this, and he said, you know, Robinhood was the first time when I knew, oh, that's what product market fit is. Right. Like, because when you experience it, it is unmistakable, right? It's like, oh, whoa, Nelly.
Yeah.
You know, and it's just like everything's just pulling stuff out of you, and you're just trying to like drive the car with 3 tires off the cliff.
Yeah.
Keep one on the cliff.
Yeah.
Because you're going so fast.
It's funny you mentioned Scotty because you referenced Play Bigger. So I went and listened to Play Bigger as well. And
Oh, cool.
And the audiobook was narrated by someone I know. And when the Scotty line came up, he did the voice of Scotty. And it was the same. She can't take much more, Captain, just like you just said.
Yeah.
Anyway. So this whole iterating thing, you also mentioned the idea of local maxima. And so this is something that I like to geek out on too. And so I just drew this little thing here, like just so people understand, like local maxima versus global maxima. And I was teaching people about this, like basically there's the problem side, and to tie it in with the problem solution, for me, problem means you're picking the right mountain to climb.
Right.
Insight, I guess, your pivot foot. And the idea is like, gosh, we're trying different things to see how we can climb up high. So I would love to hear your thoughts on
That's right. Like if you pick the wrong problem opportunity space, you might iterate and pivot to the ideal product offering, but you'll be constrained to the market upside potential of that opportunity. And so the metaphor we use was like local maximum, right? You iterate to the local maximum, and now you're at that point. And now all of a sudden you can look over the horizon. You're like, oh, that's the mountain I wanted to be on. But now I can't get there. I'm stuck on the local maximum. And so like what we wanted to get across with this idea of inflections and insights is you want to zoom out and say, okay, what is the mountain that is worth climbing?
Yes.
Because you can't know, like there's a cloud cover.
Right.
And so you don't really know if you're headed to a local maximum or global maximum. But like what you want to do is you want to say, okay, there are certain conditions under which it's worth taking the risk. And there are certain conditions it's probably not worth taking the risk.
Yeah. It's so funny you use that metaphor of fog and uncertainty. Ed Catmull, who wrote Creativity.
It's a great book.
He used that metaphor in there too. And that's kind of, I kind of came up with the same. I think about like you're on a boat just so you can go any direction. And it's fog, and you don't know where to go, right? So you got to figure out which way to go. So.
Yeah, and the other thing I love about that book and the Pixar process is just this idea of progressive iteration of the story, and I think that there's a lot that we can learn from that as startups.
Totally, yeah. If you look at Toy Story, you see the iteration that they did on Toy Story. It's like crazy. Right. It's a different movie than it was. Cool. All right, cool. Let's. What else we got? Oh. On this note here, you talked about, which I thought was a great distinction about surprises and the value of surprise. And you actually quoted Squat Cook, who's the founder of Intuit here, on talking about the value of that. And you said, so if you could talk about why they're valuable. And then you also said there's positive surprises and negative surprises, which I thought was a good distinction. So if you could share your advice on that.
So every now and then you'll be in a conversation, and then you probably have everybody in this room probably has this happen, especially since there's so many entrepreneurs. Like, a whole bunch of thoughts will come together like in one convergence, and you're like, oh my gosh, I can't unsee that. So one time I was on a panel with Scott Cook at South by Southwest, and Katie Roof, a reporter who's leading the panel, asked him a question: what do you look for when you do product reviews? And he says, I asked the team, what surprised you most? And I was like, oh my gosh, like that's one of the best questions I ever heard. Why is it a good question? Well, if you're pursuing a breakthrough, breakthroughs are by definition undiscovered. You can only have a recipe for something that's not a breakthrough, right? Like if you have a recipe to bake a cake, that's because somebody made the cake that way, right? So like breakthroughs by definition undiscovered. So you have to encounter surprises on the path of finding a breakthrough by definition. And so if you can't articulate what surprised you, the odds that you've encountered a breakthrough are extremely, extremely low, right? So, but here's the other reason it's genius. Let's say that a team's presenting to you, and they say, hey, I want a budget. I want to pursue this initiative. What surprised you? Nothing. Are they really authentically truth-seeking? Not really, right? They're not. They have an agenda. And the agenda is the thing they want rather than a quest for the truth. And so, like, when you think about it, what happens a lot of times is a startup will be trying to sell its minimum viable product, and a customer will have a set of objections. And so the startup will think, okay, if I go back and fix those objections, they're going to buy. That's not true. If they don't want your minimum viable product, they're not going to buy your maximum viable product, right? Because they're not desperate. And if they're desperate, they'll put up with what your product lacks. So what you want is to find the person who surprises you on the upside. right? Like Chegg is a great example of this. We didn't have any money to actually buy textbooks to rent. So we put up a pretend site called Textbook Flicks. And, we're like, if a textbook new is $100, students need to rent it for 35. So we pretended we had every textbook. And people would go to the site and they would try to rent a textbook. What was clever about that is Osman and Ayush didn't just test $35. They tested all the way up to $75. So now, okay, they say, yeah, I'll rent this textbook for $75. They get a 404 error. And people say, well, what good is that for Chegg? It's freaking great for Chegg because now we have a positive surprise. We know not just that people are willing to rent textbooks for 35. We know now a demand preference curve. And we know that some people are willing to rent for 75. After we did that experiment, it was patently obvious that students wanted to rent textbooks. The only concern we had is, are we going to be too slow? Are we going to be too late? But we knew we had something. We were positive we had something. But that was a great example of a positive surprise. And so why does that matter? I like to say whenever a founder creates an experiment, like in kind of in lean startups, the experiment should be instrumented so that it can yield maximum likelihood of positive surprise. If you do an experiment and you prove your hypothesis, you didn't really learn anything. Right. You just underscored what you already know. What you really want when you do an experiment is to create the conditions of strategic luck, right? You want to be like Louis Pasteur, chance favors the prepared mind, and you want to construct an experiment where you could be visited by the muse in a positive way. And so that when you see that, you're like, wait a second, hold on here. That's what it is. That's where people are desperate. That's what we need to focus on. Almost all the startups I've worked with that had great success found a positive surprise along the way that they leaned hyper aggressively into. But almost never was it, hey, customers are objecting to A, B, and C. Let's fix A, B, and C. It was almost never that.
And I would paraphrase it as saying surprise equals learning. If you don't to restate what you said, if the experiment goes exactly as expected, you have no insights, you didn't learn anything from it. So it's almost like the bigger the surprise, the bigger the learn, which I guess goes back to the insight, which is the foundation of the value creation for what you're saying.
That's right. And I suppose you can validate things.
Yeah.
Right. But that's the problem. Too many people seek validation more than they seek
insight. Yeah.
Right. Exactly. And the truth is something that you can never fully believe that you've discovered. You've always got to believe that it's an asymptote, right? That there's always a way to get
something you don't know. Something you don't know.
Always something there's a beginning of infinity what you don't know. And so that's the real gift, is to learn the positive surprise before the other people have, because you're out there in the future with a first mover advantage. By the way, this couldn't make the book because I wasn't enough of an expert in creativity. I wouldn't have been able to pull it off. Mm-hmm. I spent a lot of time studying Louis Pasteur, Isaac Newton, now Einstein, Picasso, and all these guys. Yeah. And, there's this saying, chance favors the prepared mind, and everybody accused Pasteur of getting lucky all the time. What I realized is that the way to uncover breakthroughs is not to follow a recipe or playbook. It is to be the type of person likely to encounter a breakthrough. And so Pasteur got lucky because luck visits all of us a lot, but he's just willing to answer the door when she knocks, right? And most people are trying to get through their to-do list of the day. They don't realize that they've been visited by the muse, because the muse doesn't come through the front door. She comes through the side door. But so people thought that Pasteur was lucky, but he was saying something more profound. He was saying that luck favors people who show up in the world in a certain way.
Right.
They asked Isaac Newton at a party one time, how is it that you figured gravity out when the apple fell on your head? And he said, it's because I was thinking about it all the time. And that's true, sure. Right? That's what it looks like. They're thinking about it all the time, but they've got their noticing filter on volume 11, right? It's one of my favorite verbs of entrepreneurship is noticing.
Yeah.
Right? It's such an important verb because, you have to have your noticing filter tuned into the possibility of being surprised always.
Yeah. Well, at that point, we have to quote Donald Rumsfeld, right? You have known knowns, known unknowns, and unknown unknowns. And there are always unknown unknowns. There's asymptotic, as you said, right?
Yep.
And I'll take the examples, I geeked out on the Wright brothers. Like they had the insight, like we're going to fly. And they had an Edison with the light bulb. Same thing, right? They just had to go through a lot of permutations. Yep. That's a great segue to the last framework I want to share. This is an older from your blog post, agility plus strategic rigor.
Yep.
I love this because I think that there are a lot of startups that are trying to be lean and do stuff. They're agile, but maybe they don't have the rigor. There are a lot of traditional companies that have rigor. So can you share your...
So this is kind of another way of describing the issue. The upper left is really local maximum, right? Low strategic rigor, high flexibility, speed. Traditional startups, there aren't many of those anymore. And I like to call the folks who have high strategic rigor and flexibility the prime movers.
Yes.
Because they move the world. And that's what you want. You don't want to fit within the other guy's sandbox. You want to move the world. You want to move the world to a different future. So I like to say there's two kinds of futures. One future is a new and improved version of the present. The incumbents win that future.
Right.
So like if I'm a startup, I have to say, I have to start with a premise that the future I pursue has to be radically different by definition. That's the only chance I have to make a difference. And so therefore I need to show up in a radically different future and move people to that different future. Right. And that's why I call those people prime movers, because they're the first people who move people to that different future.
Got it. This is awesome if you're at a startup, but what if I'm not in a startup, Mike? How can I apply these ideas and principles if I'm at an established company?
Yeah. So the one thing I would say is that the thing that I think that non-startup-y people can get from this is the value of being different. And it's sort of like, I was talking to some guy not long ago, and he runs a bakery. And he's like, how would I be a pattern-breaking bakery? And I was like, I don't know, some guy in Boston invented the crumb nut, right? And it's like, that's I look at like a 5-hour energy drink. Yeah. And I'm like, how do they get away with that? It's like, it's basically the same ingredients as Coca-Cola in a smaller container that they charge more money for. And now they're on a different part of the supermarket. And I'm like, that's genius. And so like, I think that the Cybertruck's not a startup. So like, I look at it like, the thing about different is believable. Especially from a startup, but just in general, it's believable. If you say I'm better than what's come before, why would people believe that? Why would people believe you're better than something that's already happened, that person is still there doing that thing? It doesn't make sense. It's not credible. Different is believable. Different sticks. Better does not. Different forces a choice. And that's what we need to do, right? And so I think that even if we're in a big company, I think that, and then the other part of being in a big company, I think, is big companies have different risk profile than a little company. And so you want to create the conditions where you can experiment and fail a lot, not under the visibility of the C-suite, and only make it visible to the C-suite when it's an unambiguous success that you want to double down on. Because like, as soon as it becomes a career limiting move to fail, you've changed the failure equation, right? You've changed the entire risk profile of the enterprise, right? And so, I like to say when you're going after a different breakthrough, strikeouts shouldn't matter, but neither do base hits, right? Because if you get a base hit, you didn't get paid for the risk you took. It wasn't worth it. And so, it's your willingness to strike out that gives you a chance to get the grand slam. But you got to be swinging for the fences, and you got to be, when you make that visible, you got to have a lot of confidence in your ability to pull that off, I think.
Cool. Yeah. And last question for me is, you had a great quote: be disagreeable, but not a jerk. Yeah. Can you explain that and the advice people should take from that?
Yeah. And this is why I don't think I was cut out to be a CEO. I had this roommate in college named Joe Lemont who dropped out of Stanford and started this thing called Trilogy. And then and now he has a private equity firm. He's like the Forbes 400. And Joe is like proudly disagreeable, right? The guy has no fear. doesn't care what you think about him. He's risk seeking. And that's not me, right? But like I noticed that the founders that I was working with were not disagreeable in a cantankerous sense necessarily. Like, selling your company on eBay is disagreeable in the sense that it doesn't agree with the convention. Funding your company by selling cereal boxes like Brian Chesney. Steve Jobs, he'd be in a meeting and he'd look at people in the meeting and he'd notice somebody in the meeting. It's like, hey, why are you in this meeting? Well, I was invited, blah, blah, blah. He's like, I don't think we need you here for this. But he doesn't worry about whether it hurts that person's feelings. He's just like, hey, the right answer is a smaller group. That's what we're going to do. So I noticed that a lot of the founders, but like what I also found is that being too agreeable is a form of inauthenticity, just like being a jerk is. What you want to do is find the balance so that you can express your truth. But you're also going to have to decide, is the mission of the startup more important or is fitting in and keeping the peace more important? The Lyft guys had to launch an illegal service in San Francisco that we knew was illegal. They knew was illegal. But okay, what happens? You go to the San Francisco local government and say, we got a great idea. People are going to love this. Can we change the law and launch this? Of course not. Of course they would have said no. The only way you're going to make the mission happen is if you launch it illegally and you're negotiating with the San Francisco local government, but now they have to take something away from people that everybody likes. That's the only way you're going to fulfill the mission. And so, most people aren't willing to launch an illegal service or sell their company on eBay or fund their company selling zero. But most people don't even know that's an option. But like the disagreeable founders have that kind of trait, I find.
Yeah. Cool. Right. All right. We'll do one or two audience questions. Sure. One is, so you had this great thing. I love the visual you said of when you're living in the future, you're ahead of everybody else. The insights are coming. So it's like you see the waves first because you're almost like you're surf further out. It's
almost like you get to surf the waves before anybody else shows up.
Yeah, exactly. Right. So, and I thought of this question, and it's one of the top questions is what tips do you have for people to position themselves there? To position themselves, how do they live in the future? Yeah. I would say, how do you position yourself so that you're...
One of my favorite founders that did this well is this woman named Maddie Hall at Living Carbon. So Living Carbon makes these genetically engineered trees that grow really fast and have harder wood, take more carbon out of the atmosphere. So, but Maddie was like a liberal arts major and was a product manager at Zenefits. And she decides that she wants to do a startup. She starts thinking of startup ideas. And one day she runs into Sam Altman. And Sam says, you're going about this wrong. You're trying to think of a startup. Why don't you just follow me for a while? Why don't you be my chief of staff? So you think about what's it like if you follow Sam Altman for a year and a half? You're going to get exposed to a lot of different futures. You get exposed, who knows, right?
Potential futures.
A lot of different potential futures, right? But like, I guess, I love that example because Maddie made a choice to catapult herself into a different future. And so I just think that you must get out of the present, right? You must find a way to get out of the present. It's like one of the most important precursors, I think, to success. A lot of people, they're living in the future and they just happen to be there. They don't even realize it's profound that they're living in the future. But if that's not you, then the job is to find a way to catapult yourself into one.
Got it.
Or find someone who has.
Got it. Cool. Yeah. Okay. The other question was, what are good ways for people to look for pattern breaker companies to work at?
I tend to like companies that have very high agency people in their culture. The PayPal was like this back in the day. I think Scale AI is like this right now. There are some companies that give young, inexperienced people crazy levels of responsibility before they're ready as just part of how they do stuff. I like those companies because you tend to meet other high agency people who are likely to get involved with pattern breaking ideas. Whereas there are other companies like for example, Apple is a great company, but I don't know if Apple is the absolute number one company I would work at if I was trying to hang out with fellow pattern breakers, right? Like I think that a lot of people are perfectly content to work at that spaceship for a long time and succeed in the Apple culture. And good for them. Apple's a great company. It's magical. But so I encourage people to think about companies that have an ethos of high agency at the front lines, because those people those companies end up being like a magnet for those type of people.
Well, it's interesting because I think you're totally right. My experience in the Valley, if I had to guess the company has the longest tenure, tech company where the average tenure is longest, probably Apple would be one of the top.
It'd be high.
Yeah, because people don't leave. Once you go there, check in, they don't check out.
Great company.
Yeah,
good for them.
But the interesting thing that I think of is I think a lot of people probably aren't living in the future, but then I think about some of this that within Apple, I feel like there might be some high agency, like Johnny Ive, right? Like certain people, I think if you're within a certain space, you might, but I hear he's not a general kind of thing. Got it.
Yeah. And I think a lot of the people at Apple who are pattern breakers, they're like, well, I want to do that with an Apple because I can create a product that changes the future at Apple.
Yeah. At scale.
Yeah. At scale.
Yeah. Awesome. Cool. Okay. Well, Mike, thank you. I know we're at time, so thank you, everybody. Let's give one more applause. Thank you so much, man. Appreciate it. Awesome.